Hello from ABA Tech Show 2019 in Chicago, Illinois. I'm Christopher Anderson.
Basha Rubin.
Emily Wajert.
And we are on the road with Legal Talk Network. And we're back. Thank you so much for joining us on the road. It's a pleasure to be here at the Hyatt Regency in Chicago. And today we are talking about the gig economy. And as I was saying before, I thought we were going to talk about the gig economy. So I'm totally unprepared for this interview, but we're going to go forward anyway. But before we do, Basha Rubin and Emily, what's your last name, Emily?
Wajert.
Emily Wajert, will you just please introduce yourselves? Tell us a little bit about your background.
Absolutely. My name is Basha Rubin. I'm CEO and co-founder of Priori Legal. Priori is a global legal marketplace for InHouse Teams. And we've created two things: a global vetted network of boutique firms and a technology platform that sits on top of the attorney network and aims to drive efficiency at every stage of the process of working with outside counsel.
Very cool.
And I am Emily Wajert. I am an associate in the employment group at Kramer Levin in New York City.
Fantastic. All right, so you guys had a presentation. We were talking about the gig economy. And one of the topics that came out that you said was pretty interesting was about classification between like what is an IC, an independent contractor, what is an employee, and how do the gig workers fit into that? So what can you share with listeners about that?
Sure. It was, we spent a good deal of time in our talk talking about classification issues because it's one of the most interesting issues that gig employers are facing right now. Are their workers employees or are their workers independent contractors? And, what cases are finding is that they really don't fit into any of the models, and there are different tests, classification tests used across jurisdictions. The tests vary within jurisdictions as well, so it can really get quite complicated.
Right, those tests were really designed around businesses that had employees and sometimes had contractors, so you could tell whether the person could be classified as an independent contractor or an employee, but the gig economy's changed that. What makes it different?
Absolutely. So with the advent and now ubiquity of companies that act as an intermediary between workers and the consumers, the working environment looks very different than the idea of a freelancer who was, working directly with their customers.
Right.
And the other thing that I think is pretty interesting, and when I started to dig into this, is to realize that even within the gig economy, there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution, because you have about 30% of it working adults participated in the gig economy in the last year, but for an average of 5 hours per month.
Yeah, you were talking about that. So 30%, that's almost a third of people. And 5 hours a month, it sounds like a little, but I mean, we're talking about a third of the people doing something every single month, or maybe more on occasional months. So this isn't just a one-off problem. This isn't a little remote issue. This is becoming big.
Yeah, and it's when you think about what the right policy outcome is, it probably looks different than the adult who's doing it to supplement their income 5 hours a month than someone who's really using the gig economy to emulate what used to be a full-time job.
Sure. Now, I mean, I think the listeners, when we think about the gig economy, people automatically, of course, think of Uber or Fiverr or Fancy Hands or what's that one? The big one?
Upwork?
Upwork, yeah. They just merged a couple other ones. Is this what we're talking about with the gig economy, or does it have different flavors?
That's the type of thing we're talking about with the gig economy, but obviously there are more companies and more different kinds of industries than those that I think are the most in our face.
Yeah. So one of the things you were talking about is how this is affecting the legal marketplace.
Yeah.
And you used a very interesting word. You said legal marketplace disaggregation. Can you just tell us a little bit about what your presentation or what you're talking about with that?
Absolutely. So as you know, I run a legal marketplace, and we don't really think of ourselves as being in the gig economy, but we are in the on-demand economy. And what that means...
What's the difference? Yeah.
The way in which I'm thinking about it is different is that for us, the folks that are that work on our supply side are actually at law firms. So they're thinking about us as a business development channel. And so many of the issues that are at stake when we were talking about what's concerning in the gig economy from a policy perspective just don't apply at all in the legal context. But we are increasingly seeing top talent leaving big law firms to practice law differently, more flexibly, more on their own terms. And I think that with technology and platforms like Priori and others in the space, case, we're going to see more and more of that kind of flexibility where you don't need an office and an admin and all of these baked-in tools, but you can instead use cloud-based technology to practice law much more flexibly and use apps and platforms to get clients, much like in other industries.
Yeah, you talked about it from the like you said, the supply side. And the lawyers are actually working in law firms, but you see some of them coming out of law firms and offering these services as independent individuals, independent contractors. I don't want to use it because it's a term of art that we've been talking about. Let's talk, what's this looking like from the demand side? How are people consuming law in this way?
So we're seeing a really increased. I've been doing this now for about 5.5 years, and there's been a sea change in the last, I would say, year and a half. We work with major corporates, and I think with the rise of legal operations and digital natives with increasing purchasing power within major organizations, we're just seeing so much more demand for thinking about who is the right attorney for any project. How can I get the most cost efficient? So how can I maximize cost efficiency and excellence rather than just saying, oh, we should go to this big law firm down the street that we've had a relationship with for a really long time.
So you find like general counsel in these organizations might be building their own team, like from someone from the left, someone from the right, someone from the middle, and just putting it all together themselves.
That's what we're seeing as one of the primary use cases of our platform. We have companies that are hiring a fleet of attorneys who do data privacy work, for example, and they're all throughout the world, and they have slightly different expertise, and we're seeing in-house teams using that instead of going to big law firms.
Cool. Well, we started the conversation today about talking about classification, misclassification, and we alluded to the fact that it's different across jurisdictions, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the case law and how it's shaping up, not just case law, but case law legislation, how the law is changing around this gig economy.
Sure, it's definitely really interesting, and every day it seems that a decision is being made or legislation's being discussed that could potentially have great effects over, across the nation. Particularly in our talk, we talked about one case in California from 2018. It was Dynamex is the title of the case, and there the California courts changed the classification test in California to a new test called the ABC test, and it's a difficult test for employers who want to classify their workers as independent contractors to meet.
So they lean more heavily towards finding them to be employees.
Right, exactly. So, since that decision, a lot of gig employers have started to write letters to their legislators explaining this is an issue for them and saying this is a problem and asking them to step in and fix it. So it will be interesting to see how California addresses this.
So that's interesting. So California moved it towards a bias towards employees, but it's the gig workers who are saying this is hurting us. Like, don't do that.
It's the gig employers that are saying that.
The employers are doing, okay.
Yes.
So the workers are happy to be classified as employees.
Right.
Got it. And so you mentioned California. How is this working across the country? How are jurisdictions differing, and what are the pitfalls for workers and or employers of these gig economy people?
Well, the pitfalls are definitely that there are different tests used across the country. So, for example, in Pennsylvania, they use an economic realities test, which is a 6-factor test. So it's definitely difficult for employers to identify which tests apply. And it's obviously creating conflicting results as well. If you're applying one test, you could get a different result than if you're applying another test.
Is there a national test? Is there a U.S. test that people can look towards?
The Department of Labor uses the economic realities test, but again, it just depends on which law you're dealing with.
How do you see this shaking out? How is this going to get fixed?
I mean, that's a great question. That's kind of the $1 million question. I think that
probably more than $1 million.
Yeah.
Somebody at some point, probably the federal government, is going to have to step in and realize that, the gig economy doesn't fit into the traditional models of employment and independent contractor, and there's going to have to be a third bucket created, really.
That sounds like it. All right. Well, before we close out the show for today, what I'd like to do is have each of you tell the listeners how they can follow up. How can they reach you for more information on this really interesting topic?
Absolutely. I can be reached at Basha, BASHA, .Rubin, RUBIN, at priorilegal.com. That's PRIORI, legal spelled the normal way, .com, or at Basha Rubin on Twitter.
Awesome.
And I can be reached at my email address, EWAJERT at kramerlevin.com.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. And we have reached the end of the road for today's episode. I want to thank our guests for joining us today. Thank you, Basha. Thank you, Emily. And I also want to thank our listeners for tuning in. If you like what you heard today, please subscribe, rate, and review us in Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or your favorite podcasting app. We'll see you next time for another episode of On the Road with Legal Talk Network.
If you'd like more information about what you've heard today, please visit LegalTalkNetwork.com. Subscribe via iTunes and RSS. Find us on Twitter and Facebook, or download our free Legal Talk Network app in Google Play and iTunes. The views expressed by the participants of this program are their own and do not represent the views of, nor are they endorsed by, Legal Talk Network, its officers, directors, employees, agents, representatives, shareholders, and subsidiaries. None of the content should be considered legal advice. As always, consult a lawyer.